what are the implications of such policy, of a global minimum tax for the citizens and also for the business at global level?
The most important thing to understand about this G7 initiative is that it's part of a long-running project on the part of high-tax governments and international bureaucracies like the OECD. There has always been a hostility against tax competition by politicians who, of course, want more power and control over the economy. And they've used bureaucracies like the OECD and now the G7 to try to advance their policies of restraining and restricting tax competition. And what makes this really offensive is that it's contrary to even the research of economists at places like the OECD and the IMF. Economists across the board understand that high taxes on saving and investment and entrepreneurship are among the worst ways in terms of economic damage, the worst ways of trying to collect revenue. And yet, what are these politicians doing? Because they want to try to undermine tax competition, they're putting in place this global tax cartel, or at least they're trying to, for the very simple reason that the politicians want to make it easier for themselves to raise revenue, to increase spending so that they can buy more votes with other people's money. And probably one of the most worrisome things about this initiative is that if they put in place any type of tax cartel with this 15% minimum rate for companies, there are two things that you can very easily predict. The first thing is that the 15% rate will then begin to increase, because once a cartel is in place, and if the cartel is successful, it's in the interest of the politicians from all over the world to then say, well, let's raise it from 15 to 20, from 20 to 25, from 25 to 30. It'll never end. But then perhaps even worse, the second prediction that we can make is that if they successfully implement a global tax cartel for corporate income, it's simply a matter of time before they try to impose global tax cartels for personal income, for capital gains. There's already, of course, a tax cartel in the European Union. Your value-added tax rate has to be at least 15%. But we'll see other types of global tax cartels on dividend income, you name it. The goal of these politicians, of the OECD for decades, has always been to figure out ways to extract more money from the productive sector of the economy. And if we don't stop them here, they'll simply capture this additional power, and then they'll use that as a springboard for even higher taxes in other areas of public life.
So yeah, well, thank you. And so it's my understanding that, in your opinion, the fair way to increase revenue for government is just to let economies and businesses grow. Is it correct? Is a good interpretation?
My view on public finances is that governments already are far too big. There's a lot of academic and scholarly research on what is the growth maximizing size of government. And that research pretty conclusively shows that you shouldn't let the public sector consume more than about 20% of an economy's output. And of course, if you look in the United States, if you look at various European countries, even the so-called small government countries have government spending burdens well above 30% of GDP. And in places like France and some of the Nordic countries, governments are consuming more than 50% of economic output. And so when you have a very big burden of government spending, it of course makes sense that politicians are very anxious to try to figure out new ways to raise revenue. But if you start with the assumption that government's too big, then the last thing we should ever do is give politicians new ways of collecting more revenue. It's sort of like trying to cure an alcoholic by giving him the keys to a liquor store. It's exactly the wrong approach. Governments should not have more money. Government should have less money. And that's why tax competition has been one of the few good things that we've seen in international economic policy. It's why we've seen tax rates come down. I would like to claim that politicians around the world over the last 40 years have been lowering tax rates because they were reading my studies. No, they've only been lowering tax rates because of the pressure of tax competition. When Reagan and Thatcher slashed tax rates, other countries had to do the same thing, not because they wanted to, but because they knew they would lose jobs and investment to other countries. We need to keep this liberalizing force of tax competition alive. It's our only hope if we want to try to keep politicians from taxing and spending our economies into Greek-style fiscal crisis.